Hi everybody, it's David at Tribal Habits here, and welcome to today's Best Practices webinar. I'm actually going to kick off bang on time today as we have a lot to cover. Today's topic is on organizing content for online learning, and hopefully you can see my screen. I've actually got some PowerPoint slides up. Usually in these sessions, I jump straight into some practical application, and I'm going to get there today. But today's topic is a little bit different, and we need to look through a little bit of theory to get some context and some reasoning behind some of the practical rules and application I'm going to look at in the second half of this session. Actually, this topic was kind of interesting for me in its preparation. I think over the years, I have attended a number of workshops and webinars on instructional design, and then developed my own thinking around this. And in preparing for this session, it gave me good cause to stop and sit back and really consider where had I got to as an instructional designer myself in my thinking around organization of content. And in doing that, I got a chance to revisit some science and some theory that lies behind that and kind of pull things together. I've only got 30 minutes today to run through that, including practical demonstration. So we're going to look at some science at a kind of a high level and then jump into things. And underlying this, here's what I'm thinking. When it comes to online training, we are in an asynchronous environment. We are not with the learner when they are learning. And they'll be therefore we are unable to respond dynamically with our content and to adjust based on what we're observing in, we would say, a facilitator-led session. In addition, learners can go at a self-pace in online learning. They're going to go at their own pace. And that actually gives us some benefits, particularly when we're talking about the transfer of learning today. But it's also another design factor that differs in an instructor-led session where the instructor very much sets the pace and is often working within a specified time frame, like I am today, in 30 minutes. But in self-paced, as much as I might say this module takes 30 minutes, someone may complete it in 15 minutes or 45 minutes because they're going to go at their pace. In all cases, I need to organize the content in a way that is going to help with the transfer of learning. So today's session isn't simply about making things look pretty or about the practical work function of transferring content. It's organizing content for online training in a way that enhances learning, the transfer of knowledge. And thus begins the little bit of theory we're going to go through. So in cognitive psychology, we can think of our memory as consisting of, broadly speaking, two parts. We have our working memory, and then we have our long-term memory. So our long-term memory is what we need to change to get new behaviors or new skills. So we need to transfer knowledge into long-term memory to adapt someone's behaviors or skills over the long term and to get those success factors we're looking for in learning. Unfortunately, we can't plug new knowledge directly into long-term memory. Sitting in front of long-term memory is a buffer called working memory, and it essentially is the label on the tin. It is where we contemplate ideas, and hopefully those ideas are assimilated into our long-term memory through a process of contemplation, analysis, reflection. So our working memory's job is to take new knowledge and essentially analyze it and put it into a sense that means something to us, into a framework or a schema that resonates with us and will fit into our particular long-term memory, and then it's embedded. So really, as learners, what we're focused on is this working memory. If we can get things going really well in working memory, the transfer of learning should occur. So let's get stuck in and think about working memory. And so in cognitive psychology, they have this concept called cognitive load. And cognitive load is essentially the amount of resources you're using in your working memory. So you could consider that you have, say, 100 units of available capacity in your working memory when you're learning. And cognitive psychology breaks up those units and applies them to three things when you're learning. The first one is your intrinsic cognitive load. So this is the amount of working memory capacity that is taken up by the intrinsic difficulty of the topic. So harder content takes up more of your working memory because it's harder to understand. It's as simple a fact as that. Simple content takes up less. The next part is extraneous cognitive load. So this is the part of your working memory that is devoted to how the information is taught to you. So this is the manner in which the information is presented. If it's presented well, you don't have to devote much of your cognitive load. If it's presented badly, you have to devote a lot. What's left is your domain cognitive load. This is the rounding number. It's the remainder. And your domain cognitive load is the resources you can apply to processing and constructing schemas or frameworks for this information to put into your long-term memory. So it's real simple. If the intrinsic cognitive load is really high and the extraneous cognitive load is really high, there's not much left in that germane cognitive load. To put it this way, if the topic's really complex and it's taught in a really complex way, you're just so busy trying to make sense of it all. Out of the hundreds of units that you have in your cognitive load, there's just not enough units left to actually process. You're just out of horsepower, out of bandwidth. And so this is where we can think now about what can we do about this from the position of a designer and thinking about training. So let's think about intrinsic cognitive load first. This is the inherent level of difficulty associated with the topic. We cannot alter that. Topics are as difficult as they are. What we could do, though, is break the topic up into pieces, and some of those pieces might be easier than other pieces. In other words, we could, in theory, isolate the harder pieces of the topic and then teach them in a way in little bits and bobs, so that when we're teaching the easy stuff, the intrinsic cognitive load is lower, people can assimilate it. And essentially we isolate the really high intrinsic cognitive load just for some special attention to make the rest easier to learn. And so that's breaking up content into little pieces and then reassembling them as a whole at the very end. And we'll talk through that process today. Next is the extraneous cognitive load. This is the difficulty of the training. This is where we probably have the greatest ability to improve things. So if we can present things well, then we can keep the extraneous cognitive load low. We're making it easy to learn by presenting it in a useful way. And this is a combination of how we structure up the content, in addition to the actual learning techniques, the learning interactions we use. And we'll look at both of those today, which leaves the germane load. And ideally, again, it's quite simple. If we can isolate all the intrinsic stuff that's hard, and if we can make the extraneous easy, there's lots left for germane. We give them lots of space, lots of available units to think about processing, to think about understanding, to think about creating that framework they need, and that all increases their retention. So the more germane load, the better they're going to remember it in the long term. A couple of key things to think about before you get into practical stuff. So if you have really high intrinsic and extraneous cognitive load, complex topic presented badly, we're definitely going to have problems with learning. People have difficulty. It just interferes with their learning process, not enough bandwidth left for analysis. But it's a Goldilocks problem. In the second box, a really light cognitive load can be a problem too. You think about it. If the content is really simplistic and it's taught in a really simplistic way, so out of the 100 units, only 5 units go to intrinsic and 5 units go to extraneous, that leaves 90 units for germane. You might be thinking, that's fantastic. That's lots of horsepower, but it's actually too much. They don't need all of that to process that simple information. But of course, matter must be filled. And so we start to fill our working memory with other distractions because we're not finding the training very engaging. It's just not challenging us. So we start to think about other things. We use up that available capacity. And so that can create a learning problem too. We can even fail to learn simple things because we get distracted. So it's a Goldilocks problem. We need an appropriate amount of engagement so that we maintain their attention on what we're trying to teach them. We also have to keep in mind that there's no solution here that fits everybody. Processing power differs between people. Adults tend to learn faster than children because adults have life experience. They have built schemas and frameworks from prior learning, and they can reach into those existing frameworks in their mind and apply them to new knowledge very quickly, process it very fast, and get it into long-term memory. In addition, due to life experiences, some people simply process things faster than other people. And it can even just be on different topics. You know, some people just process very technical things very quick, but process soft skills very slowly and vice versa. So we're not going to have a kind of a one-stop solution here. We can only do our best here because we are teaching asynchronously. It's got to be the same for everyone. We've got a final issue as well with adults in that all that prior knowledge they've got, all those existing frameworks and schemas can sometimes be a problem, and they can create an issue of cognitive dissonance. You might have heard this term before and be familiar with it. It's that uncomfortable feeling you get when you're trying to reconcile two conflicting beliefs. So typically you might have thought situation A was the truth, but in the process of learning, you now realize that situation B is the truth. And that feels very uncomfortable as you try and rebuild schemas, as you try and break down frameworks that you have in your behaviors and belief systems to allow these new ones to come in. And cognitive dissonance can be a real problem for adults, particularly in soft skills training, where they have to unlearn before they can learn. And this creates a problem for, we're thinking about training and how much load we want to put on them, because to break down those existing barriers, those existing beliefs, we may actually need quite high cognitive load to really break it apart. And in that case, if we go too light and too easy, we don't really break down what was there and the long-term belief doesn't change. So this is a complex topic. And it's taken me 10 minutes of the first 30 minutes just to get through some high-level introduction materials here. But essentially where we're heading is that we want to reduce intrinsic and extraneous cognitive load as much as we can, to increase germane cognitive load as much as required, to give the learners every possible chance to analyze what's going on, put it into a framework that makes sense in their mind, and then put that schema, that framework, into their long-term memory. That's kind of the high level of what we want. I'm going to show you some practical applications of that for the remaining 20 minutes that we have. But ideally, if you've understood that general framework, and there's lots of stuff on the internet around cognitive psychology and cognitive load, that can probably give you some good guidelines as to where you're going when you're thinking about your content and thinking about your learners as just a base level. I'm going to jump in and look at some practical things. I'm getting a fair clip today to get through some stuff. If you have questions as we're going, would like me to explain anything better than the first time I explained it, would like to check scenarios with me, just jump into chat. I've got to open my screen and I'll be keeping an eye on it. Let's begin. I'm going to begin with intrinsic cognitive load. So this is the raw content itself, remembering that more complex, more difficult topics have a higher intrinsic load because they are simply harder to understand. There is more complexity to the information. And that takes up more units of available units in our cognitive load or our working memory. And so we have to think about this. And I'm going to give us 3 practical considerations and then demo some inside of tribal habits. So the first thing I'm thinking about is size. So if the information is complex, well, one thing we can do is simply reduce the amount of information. So I'm often thinking, what's the minimum amount of information I can provide which creates a meaningful learning engagement? Related to that is the concept of hard edges. So if we think about our working memory as like a buffer, we're going to fill it up with some intrinsic knowledge, which they're going to analyze, and they're hopefully going to transition that into long-term memory. Ideally, what we want them to then do is wipe the buffer and then allow new information to come in. This is much easier to do when we have hard edges in the content, when it is clear that a certain component or idea is finished. There is no more new information coming on it. They can finish their processing and finish storing it and now forget about it and move on to the next thing in their working memory. A very common problem I see in learning, particularly online learning, is a lack of hard edges, and content A and content B bleed into each other, and it doesn't allow this buffer clearing exercise. So we're first of all thinking about the amount of content we provide, and then having really clear edges on it, where we can subconsciously or even consciously say to the learner, that's it for this content. Finish processing, we'll take a break, now we'll move on to the next. Can be very important for long-term memory. Finally, particularly for more complex, harder, higher intrinsic cognitive load, we need to think about reward or achievement. So a feeling of progression or mastery, so that someone feels they're not just getting overwhelmed, but they're actually moving forward. They're feeling better. They're feeling like, I'm getting it, I'm going forward. And it allows them to take that deep breath, clear the buffer, and dive back in. These 3 things can all be managed in the way we organize content as a starting point. So in tribal habits, I tend to think about then the bundles of content that we have, and how can we assemble them in a way where we manage the size, the hard edges, and the feeling of progression. And if you're not using tribal habits, that's fine. These same concepts would work in any sort of e-learning. So at the very smallest end in tribal habits, we have a thing called an element. An element is an individual piece of content. So it could be a few paragraphs of text. It could be an interactive image, a short video, an insight with a frequently asked question, maybe a series of flip cards. It's a small contained piece of knowledge. And then we can bundle up a series of elements under a section heading. And so a section then is a small bundle of elements on a subcomponent of a point. And then we bundle up sections into a point. So a point is a bundle of sections on a major component in a topic. So we might have an overall module we're doing, and it is going to consist of points. Each point consists of a series of sections. Each section consists of a series of elements. And each of these then present opportunities for size, edges, and achievement in the way we present them. Each time we present a new section of elements, we are flooding the working memory with content, and we need to think about how much do we want to flood in, give them a chance to assemble that, and make sure those section breaks have hard edges. So when they move to another section, it's creating that opportunity to reset the buffer and jump in. Within a module, we may just have one point, which in tribal habits terminology would be an article, or a module would have multiple points, each containing multiple sections and elements. So something a bit longer, we would call that a topic. And then sitting above topics in tribal habits, we have pathways. They are bundles of articles and topics. And soon to be released in the next few months, we're going to have a journey, which isn't on this page. A journey is a bundle of pathways. Thinking about all of this, the first thing I do when I'm approaching my learning is to think about, okay, where should I begin on this here? I begin at the topic articles level. What is a module going to look like and how long is it going to be? And then I'm going to break it down from there. So I'm going to stop sharing here and I'm going to jump over into tribal habits. And I'm going to go through the process of creating a training module. I'm going to create a topic. Today's article is how to survive a thunderstorm, because where I am, we've had several in the last few days. And then I'm going to put what the training is about. Now, sometimes I write this at the start because I've already decided it. Other times I'm not sure. I'm kind of on a bit of an exploratory process. I'm just going to fill it with some placeholder content for now, but that would be typically summarizing what's in there, what we're covering. Usually it's a summary of all the points. Then I go through why it's important. This is the learning objectives or the benefits. So we'll just throw them in. Then I have who it's for. This is just summarizing which the learner should be. I'm just going to put in collaborative, just basic text for all that so I can get into the brainstorming process. So in tribal habits, we go through a bit of an outlining process, and it begins when I skip through these first few pages to this point here where it asks me to think about my points. So I've got a topic, how to survive a thunderstorm. And I'm now thinking, right, how long do I want this to be? I like my online learning to be somewhere between 15 and 60 minutes in length. I think 60 minutes is a long time for an online module. I like that feeling of progression I get when I finish the whole module. I may get a certificate. I may have a break at that point, but whatever it is, I feel like I've kind of progressed and I'm learning something. So I'm kind of looking 60 minutes max, 15 minutes shortest, because I think at 15 minutes, if it's less than 15 minutes, almost what's the point? I mean, it's so short to learn. It's not enough time for me to clear up my working memory from whatever I was doing beforehand and actually concentrate on this. So if I'm thinking kind of 15 to 60 minutes, I'm thinking I'm probably going to need 2 to 6 points as a good starting thing. So now I'm going to start breaking things up. How to survive? Well, first of all, my first point could be something around, identifying the risks of a thunderstorm. Is there one going to come? And then it's going to be preparation work. I'm making this up on the spot beforehand. And then when in the thunderstorm, and then we might do the aftermath. And I've gone with 4 here, but this is my chance to actually have a think. Are these all hard edges? Like when I finish talking about the risks, is that a good break? Is that a hard break at that point? And I could move to a whole separate point about it to allow someone to clear their memory at that point and feel like I get it. I have conquered point 1. I feel like a master of point 1. So they've got the achievement part as well. I also need to think about the size. So if we keep working over here in tribal habits and we're working with Sage, our little digital designer here, the next question she's going to ask you is, are each of these points about 5 or 10 minutes? So she's kind of asking you now to check, are each of these points an appropriate amount of information, or are any of them too short or too long? We don't want individual points that are too short because they're too simplistic. It's hard to get engagement. It's too much button clicking. We don't want them too long because then they're stuck in that point for a long time, never feeling any form of progression. So this is a chance for me to think, do I need to split points or combine them? And I'm kind of thinking this is okay, and I kind of like the order, but I might stop here now and add some more information in just to make sure about that. So with the risks, I might go through using the bomb and, understanding how thunderstorms form. In preparation work, I'm going to go through first aid and household safety and the backyard and so on and so forth, as I'm just kind of mapping out my content, thinking to myself, does this all seem to fit right? And you can kind of see as I'm doing the mapping point here, probably what I'm subconsciously doing is creating the sections within the point. So I'm setting up the sub-schemas within this point. The overall point is identifying the risks. The first section might be on the bomb. The second section is going to be understanding how they form. And so I'm starting to do this organizational process myself. And once I'm happy with that, I can move forward in this process in tribal habits, and it will take me through a few more steps to get going. But I keep coming back to those first three considerations. Is the overall topic and each of its points about the right link? So the overall topic, kind of somewhere between 15 and 60 minutes. Each point, somewhere between kind of 5 and 10 or 15 minutes. Do each of the points have hard edges? And indeed, does the topic have a hard edge? It might well be that this needs to be several topics. And I need to take this topic and break it into several topics and reassemble them under a pathway. And I kind of know that when I finish this initial process here, because I get to this point where there's like 8 points, and I'm like, ooh, this has become a really big topic. I might need to break this into 2 topics, 2 separate modules, a part 1 and a part 2. Again, to allow that feeling of progression, to stop people feeling overwhelmed, to give them their certificates for both or feeling achievement for both. I'm just going to stop sharing for a little bit and hit back to the PowerPoint and move on to extraneous side of things. So on the extraneous side of things, what I'm thinking through here is, okay, we've broken up the content into bite-sized pieces or appropriate sized pieces with hard edge, feeling of progression. And really we were talking about modules and their points. Now I need to go to the next layer of detail, sections and their elements. And this is where the learning interaction now becomes important. So now I'm within an individual point. I've got all my section headings. I now need to look at what's an appropriate amount of information within each section. And I can maintain my hard edges here in appropriate sizes. So I'm kind of thinking about 3 things here. I'm thinking about chunking things up. I'm thinking about taking my content and chunking it up into the smallest pieces I can. So when I look and think about my content, I'm always thinking, what's the smallest piece? So it could be 1 FAQ, question and answer, 1 2-minute video, 1 image with 5 clickable areas on it that explain it. And then I'm going to look at how I assemble those. So I'm going to assemble them within a section. I also need a bit of variety. To go back to that earlier point, if the extraneous load is too light, because it's too simplistic, say it's all text on the screen and nothing else, we have leftover germane load that we don't need to use, which we use to distract ourselves. So I've got to keep them engaged with some extraneous load here. In addition, since we're working with a wide variety of people and we don't know their learning styles in online training, having a variety of elements helps deal with that. If the text didn't work for them, we might get them with some video or with some flip cards or with a scenario or something else. So I need a little bit of interaction. The last thing, and I think the secret sauce that many instructional designers are afraid to use is reflection. So let's think about back to those 100 units of cognitive load we have. We fill up some of it with intrinsic load, how hard the content is. And we fill up some with extraneous load, which is what we're doing now, the level of interaction, which leaves the germane load. I need to get the intrinsic load down to get the germane load up to allow more processing. One thing I could do is remove the intrinsic load entirely. And so to do that, I use reflection activities, whereas I say to the learner, there is no more new content in this point. So there's no more content to come in. Instead, we're just going to focus on extraneous learning, where we're going to reflect upon what we've learned. We're going to revisit learning you've already got, content you've already got, for you to reflect upon it, perhaps in a new context, perhaps in a way for you to think about your choices again or your decisions again, or perhaps to reflect upon lessons from other people, from your peers at that point. In all cases, I'm reducing the intrinsic load, increasing the extraneous load a little bit, but ultimately increasing the germane load a little bit as well. I'm just letting them process for a while, which is why when you look at many of the modules in our own libraries, they often end with reflection activities. And that could just be a few scenarios I want them to work through where they're applying the content that they've learned, or even just pure reflection questions where we ask them, what was valuable for you in this area? What was a point that really stood out? What do you think is someone overlooked? Or what would you do with this information? We've stopped the flow of new information just to allow the memory to say, okay, that's good, close that off, increase power now to other areas of cognitive thinking. So when it comes to how that works in a practical sense, if I jump back into tribal habits, let's just jump out of here. And I'm going to go into a topic that is already created and just look at a few things from the creator mode of this particular topic. So here I'm really focused on sections and their component elements. So we've already gone through and decided this topic is the right length. It has hard edges. Someone will feel good when they finished it. This topic has 4 facts, which we've built. And each of the 4 facts we feel has hard edges and is going to be about 5 to 15 minutes in length. So now we're drilling down into sections and elements. And I'm in the creator version here of Tribal Habits. So we're kind of looking at the building block editor. And so here I can see a section here, your current thoughts. It has one element in it, which is a quiz that they have to take to get them reflect on what they currently think a sales proposal is. And that's enough. Once they complete that, they move to another section element. So this is a new bit of information, which talks about the types of executive summaries, and it has a button interaction with some text, and that's it. That's all they have to process in this section before they go any further. Next is then going to revisit these 4 items, each one a separate section. So it has a section, an image, some text, and an element, and an insight element. And that's that section. So that's that bundle of elements all bundled up here. And this repeats the way through. So we have a new section, image, text, and an insight. And so you can see here that each section represents really 3 or 4 elements, 3 or 4 different elements of content. And if I hit the preview button and kind of look at how this lays out, I've already explored this part here. We can see that this section's about a screen length. This section here is about a screen length of information. And indeed, there's a little sub-schema happening here with the buttons. So this next section, when it's revealed to me, is about a screen length again. I'm absorbing this. This is all the intrinsic content I'm getting. And then it stops, allows me to say, okay, I'm ready to move on. So this is a forced hard edge. And now they move on to the next bit. There's some subtle bits of design under here. The banding of the colors is helping too. That's subtly reinforcing actual hard edges or differentiation in content. I'm trying to keep each section about the length of a screen. So about that much information at a time. And I'm trying to use 3 to 4 different elements per section max. So if I've got a section that's extending several screens and it has 7 or 8 different levels of interaction, that's probably too much extraneous load at that point. There's just too many things for me to figure out how to interact with, or for me to think about their navigation or their interactions. I'm just overwhelming them. By dividing this up, I'm limiting the extraneous load to these things: a title, an image, some text, and an insight. And so when they hit the next up, the extraneous load buffer empties, and now they can fill it up with this. So I'm trying just to keep that extraneous load buffer at about the right level, enough to engage them, not to overwhelm them, keeping the intrinsic load about this length. As I work through this, I could think about, I want to get some more reflection. So this has got a long section of information. So to put in the reflection, I might add a final section at the end, simply called reflection. And at this point, I could do a few things. I could put in a poll, asking them, of the choices above, what do they think they want to do? What stood out for them? How long do they spend on stuff? Anything that just gets them thinking about the content. I could put in a Q&A, which is an open question where I ask them, what do they want to do next? How might they change things? Anything which just gets them thinking and kind of absorbing and helping assimilate. Or I could use our reflect element and just put in our default questions, which will ask them a reflection question at the end automatically. So when I get to the bottom of this, and the final one, I now have a reflection, and I'm being asked, what's the point I most enjoyed in this fact? So I'm being forced now to re-engage up with the content again, to revisit all the little schemas that were in here and find that thing that I enjoyed. So I'm now looking at it with new context. There's no new intrinsic information, so the intrinsic buffer is emptying. I'm just engaging them in a way that gets them to kind of reflect on things. Similarly, when working with section headings, over here in Fact 4, in this particular topic, they go through some executive summary examples here, and they have to analyze them. And so if I have a look at how this looks for the learner, they are given this information and then they download an executive summary that they have to analyze. And then the next section is the analysis, and it's got a section heading, an image, a quiz, an open question, and another quiz. That's actually reasonably high extraneous load. There's a lot of little interactions here. And so to help them kind of through this, I might actually come back to this and put in some blank section headings. Let's just see. Let's just put one in for each. So I'm putting in some section breaks with no titles. So they still all fall under the first title of example 1. So if I go back and preview that, now they're just being asked this one quiz. That's fine. Yeah, okay. It doesn't. I think it doesn't. Hey, I got that correct. Excellent. I've now got a feeling of progression. Let's go to the next bit. You can see there's no section header here. It's just doing the banding. So the major section heading is still this. So I'm still in this area. Now I've got this one question to answer here, which I can answer myself. And I can then move on to the final part where I answer this. And then I move on to the next bit here. Many of these simple little changes are to do with the structure of content. Where are my breaks going to be? How much falls into each section? How many sections fall into a point? So when I'm sitting there thinking about things, and I'm either brainstorming in tribal habits, or I'm looking at PowerPoint slides or Microsoft Word document, I look at a Word document of content I need to change into online learning, and I'm immediately thinking, is this entire document a topic or 2 topics? And then within the topic, what's going to be the individual points, the sections, and the content between them? And so you might be thinking about them as chapter headings and subheadings. And if you can get that work right, where you're not overwhelming them with too much complexity all at once or too much difficulty in their learning, and you're freeing up that domain load for processing, that's where you get those long-term changes that you're looking for. I've got one final slide I want to go through and then we're done, which will just talk about some practical considerations that I've covered here today. If you're working in tribal habits and you're working with Sage, her algorithms include some key things in this area. So she's looking at the length of each of your points to see how long they are and will advise you if she thinks individual points are too short or too long. She's now also looking at the length of your sections and how many sections you have through each point. And so if you ask her to review a point, she'll tell you if you've got just too many sections, too few sections, or any sections are too long. So she's running some behind the scenes calculations for you automatically. She's also looking at the number and variety of elements that you're using. So if you ask Sage, how am I going? So if we stop sharing here and just quickly jump back into tribal habits and that topic I was editing, and we go here and ask her, what does she think of this fact? We can see here she's looking at how long it is, how many sections they are, how long the sections are themselves. And then she's down here looking at the balance of all the topics all the elements that we're using. And so she's kind of giving us some immediate feedback we can work on. Now, Sage can't read what you're actually typing, but she can look at these bits of logic, these kind of structures and best practices and framework. And even for experienced instructional designers, this is like a quick way to see if you've just made a rookie error. And maybe you do have a section or 2 in there that is just too long and you need to look for it and kind of chop it down to something a little more applicable. If you want to do that yourself, then typically what we're thinking is pathways are 2 to 10 topics or articles. Topics are 50 to 60 minutes. An article would be 5 to 15 minutes because it just has one point. Points are 5 to 15 minutes. Sections are 1 to 5 minutes. Each section is about 1 to 1.5 screens in height. Maximum of about 4 types of elements. And then you're looking for a ton of variety. So in tribal habits, you can break up your text. We have 7 different interaction layouts, narration, insights, and hotspots, which will all break your text up. And then you add in some sort of reflection, looking for a reflective opportunity on each point, some combination of polls, reflections, Q&A, or insight batters. Throwing those in, and it's actually pretty easy to get a score fairly high on these things and build out that domain load and improve the ability for your learners to analyze what you're saying and retain it. I've gone a little bit over today because this was a really big topic and I could talk about it for a long time, but I'm going to pause there. If you'd like a copy of these slides, hit me up for an email. We'll also make the recording available for everybody as well. I'm also going to hang around and just answer any general questions that come up as you're processing everything I've just told you. Otherwise, thanks so much for joining us today. I'll let you get back to your lunch.